Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Construx webinar series. I am your host, Mark Griffin. Today we are joined by Earl Beede, Construx Senior Fellow. Earl is in his almost endless string of innovation. He comes up with new topics that we can continue to discuss in these webinar series. And today we're going to talk about a subject that I think is quite interesting to many people. I think people think they're already doing it. The question really is, what is collaboration? Modern software development calls again and again for team collaboration. And unfortunately, a lot of teams who report that they are collaborative are actually just practicing incomplete collaboration activities like coordination or helpfulness and different handoffs. And while there's probably good practices, true collaboration. So in this webinar, Earl is going to explain what collaboration really is and what practices you can use to have a truly collaborative team.
Well, let's talk about collaboration, people. And I thank Mark for the introduction. So I'm going to argue in this session that collaboration is a little bit more than people just working together, because we're talking about collaboration in knowledge work. We're not talking collaboration in just digging ditches or something like that. We're talking about collaboration in knowledge work. And so what does that actually mean? So we're going to take a look at that. And what I'm going to do is I'm thinking aloud about this idea of, is collaboration something more than just working together? I'm going to think about a couple things. I'm going to think about how the solo mind works when we think about the idea of doing knowledge work. What has to happen for knowledge work for that really to be thinking about? And then I'm going to look at, say, okay, here's how we think we're collaborating today. And I call it false collaboration. Maybe it'd been better to call it incomplete collaboration, that it's people are saying they're collaborating, but they're really not. And I'm going to show what's going on given what we see in the solo work. And then we'll turn around and say, okay, what does it actually mean to be collaborative? How does that work, particularly on modern software development? And I would like to really understand that. And then we're going to look at a problem, though, because once we start seeing what true collaboration is, it's not trivial. We're going to see that we have a problem as we try to scale that up. And we're going to try to look at some solutions for scaling that. In fact, we want to look at some practices that really force collaboration, because it turns out you can't just say we're going to be collaborative. It tends not to work. And so we're going to have to figure out a better solution to that. So that's what I'm going to be thinking about over the next 40 minutes or so. And just to remind you what Mark mentioned, we do have today's the technology up on the top of your screen. You'll see a Q&A button that looks like this little bit over here. If you use that, then that will be able to queue up and he'll be able to ask questions. I kind of got my eye on the chat. I need to move a thing here so I can see the chat, but I'm going to be focusing more on you. And so Mark might have to interrupt me in the chat, and we will put this up on YouTube pretty soon. All right. So let's start to dive into this idea of what is collaboration. And I'm going to put it, first of all, in this thing saying, okay, well, let's not worry about collaboration. How does knowledge work actually happen on normal software development or other knowledge work projects? How did the solo mind kind of pull this off? And so when we think about knowledge work, a guy named Grady Booch said, any kind of knowledge work has three intellectual phases. And those three intellectual phases have to happen in order, and they all have to happen. You cannot skip them. And so what are those? And if you've been around my seminars and keynotes before, you may have seen this before, right? This idea of discovery. Discovery is saying, hey, that's the first step. We have to understand what the problem is. The example I love to use when I talk about discovery is this idea of going into the kitchen. You don't look at your hands and they're preparing food. You're going, why are they preparing food? Moment you walked in the kitchen, you're thinking, oh, I want a snack, or I need to make a meal for myself, or a meal for myself and my family. There's a reason why you're in the kitchen, even if it's just, I'm bored and looking for something to do. There's a reason there. That's what discovery is. Discovery is looking and saying, what is the problem here that we're trying to solve? And once we see the problem, then we'll invent some solution to solve it. I'm going to choose this to eat. I see that there's this available. I'm going to eat that, right? I'm hungry. I see what's available. I choose it. And then you have to do the actual work of implementation, the detailed work of how am I going to prepare it? How am I going to put it? How am I going to present it? Whether it's just a snack for me or a meal for my entire family. we have to go through all three of these phases. If we try to start somewhere in the back of this, and this is something that a lot of folks do, they try to start here and go here and say, oh, we're just going to start at invention. We're going to tell you what to build. We're going to tell you the menu, and we're going to tell you you're going to figure out how to make it, but we're not telling you why. And so you got this menu, it's for hot dogs and sauce. And all of a sudden, halfway through, you discover this is for breakfast. And you're like, hot dogs for breakfast? Really? That's not a good strategy. And so you cannot skip it, because the moment we try to start here again and go this way, people will try to guess this part. And so you cannot escape it. This is work that has to happen. We have to understand the problem. We have to think about how we're going to solve that problem. And then we have to have the detail and execution to actually solve that problem. So that's what's going on here. That's the three things that happen on knowledge work. Now, as we look at this knowledge work, it's not like they happen independently. This is all sort of happening with some degree of emphasis or focus, right? So we can say how big it is on this side. And over time, when do things likely happen? And the moment we start getting overlap, like you see down in here, the moment we get overlap, that is, we're still trying to understand why we're doing it. What meal are we making? Who's attending? You've ever had one of those big events on a meal and you're not quite sure who's showing up, yet you're starting to buy ingredients, choose menus and all this, and the whole thing is still shifting? You have this big risk. This is a risk pool down here. And this risk pool is basically arguing that we have a high probability of rework. Now, this is a critical thing, because when we're thinking about knowledge work, we want to be as effective and efficient as we can. And so wherever we have this overlap, we have a huge amount of potential rework. We have misalignment. We have making decisions that we have to remake and redo the work because we didn't understand what was going on. And so we're trying to figure out ways to avoid that overlap. That's one of our key things here. So we want to watch out what's going on. So that's how I think knowledge works in the solo mind. We have to go through three distinct phases: discovery, invention, implementation. And we've got to be careful of the overlap, because that's going to drive a lot of rework. Now, if we're working by ourselves, we can probably manage this pretty well. We can try to figure out ways to avoid the overlap. We can do it pretty well. But what happens when we start trying to work with other people? Well, when we work with other people, each person is going through this knowledge work a little bit. And we have to say, okay, we've got strategies that we've come up with over time, like, helping, handoffs, and coordination. We've got these strategies, but are these strategies really effective to actually get the solo mind problem resolved, particularly that idea of overlap? Because what we have when we have another mind showing up, we have another mind going through discovery, invention, and implementation. And so we have two people thinking, oh, what is the problem? Oh, two people thinking, how am I going to solve the problem? And two people thinking, oh, how am I best to execute that solution in real time? And what are the chances of these two minds are thinking exactly alike? I think it's pretty small, right? It's not very good. And so we've come up with some ideas here to how to do this. And one that says, well, we are collaborative, I hear sometimes, because we help each other. And when we're just helping each other, what's going on? Well, I think when we're helping each other, we have one mind that's trying to help with another mind. But what do we see? And I think this illustrates it pretty well here. I keep turning the wrong way. This illustrates it pretty well here, is that we have an overlap of two distinct minds. We have an overlap of two distinct minds, and they have different ideas of what the problem is, potentially different ideas of how to solve the problem, and different ideas of how to implement it. And so while we're helping, we're going to suffer lots of communication failures here. Why? Because they're not solving the same problem in the same way. They might be on the same product, on the same team even. I've seen this over and over again with our clients. I'll walk in. In fact, I remember one shop, we went in and we did an exercise for each group. I divided them into groups, and each group to detail out what problem their product is solving. This is the same product team. I had 3 different groups. Each one was detailing out what the product was solved. And when we exposed it, each team had a different idea of what the product was. We had done a different level of discovery for this overall. I'm going to make an adjustment here. There we go. Okay. So what do we want to do about this? Well, helping is a good thing, not necessarily bad, but it's not really collaboration yet. This is why I think it's sort of a fault grade, because we've got too much overlap. Another thing we say we do when we're saying, hey, we're collaborating, we're a collaborative team here, is that we do handoffs. I do my work and then I hand it to you. We often call this throwing over the wall. Well, you can see here in the helping, at least I was trying to have a little bit of a conversation. But again, I still got an individual mind who's doing their stuff, another individual mind doing their stuff. And maybe we're talking, but mostly when the handoff world is happening here, we're not talking even. You notice they're all just tossing it over the wall. I've did my work, and do it to your work. I'm working with an organization right now that loves this idea of dev done, then QA done. Dev does their work, and then they hand it off to QA, and QA does their work. And so the dev is saying, oh, when we're done, what happens if they find a bug? And it's like, really? You think you're done because you just did some coding and then you hand it to QA and they find bugs later on and then bring it back to you and you're thinking, how do we handle this? You're not collaborating. You're handing off. And this is leading to lots and lots of rework because when they hand it off, QA is a little bit behind them. And because they're behind them, the dev team has moved on to something else. And so when they find a bug, we have to go back, refine that work again, clear it up, and it's taking a lot more time than if we would have found that bug much sooner. So again, handoffs are not true collaboration here. We are giving work, we're flowing it through, but it's not collaboration. But what if we say we up the game a little bit? Maybe we're not just doing handoffs, but we're coordinating during those handoffs, right? We're actually talking to each other a little bit. We're having some communication going on here. Certainly a plus up, I think, rather than just pure handoffs, we can do work this coordination. Maybe you have one person even helping the coordination, like a project manager is trying to help the coordination. Well, yeah, I think we've stepped it up again. But again, you notice in the picture here, we still have two minds, that we have two different ways of thinking about the problem. And what we still see in this kind of situation here is semantic problems. What I mean by an order may not be what you mean by an order. I saw this a lot in my early career when I was working in telecommunications. The idea of a telephone number meant something different depending on the kind of application that was using it. Sometimes it was just a 4-digit extension. Sometimes it was 7 digits here in North America. Sometimes it was 10. Sometimes it was country code plus the 10. It had different meanings. And so while we would say, oh yeah, I'm passing you the telephone number, we had different ideas what that was, which led to rework because we had different minds. So when you're looking at these three kinds of things that people talk about, oh yeah, we're helpful to each other, because I hear that all the time. Oh yeah, we do work and we hand it off to each other. We flow it through. We even have a Kanban for that, because that makes it special, I guess. Or yeah, we spend a lot of time coordinating our actions. All those are not necessarily bad things, but I think they fall short of what we want to call collaboration. Because we want to call collaboration that which actually allows us to work on one problem at one time. Because here, if we say, gosh, why is helping, handoffs, and coordination? As you increase the number, I was just looking at 2 right now. As we increase the number of minds, and a lot of us have 5, 7, and then we go up to 20, 30, 50 people working on something. As we increase the number of minds in these situations, what is the likelihood that all of them are going to be understanding the problem the same way? What's the likelihood they're all going to be thinking of the solution the same way when they have different ideas of the problem, or they're going to implement their stuff? And I think that the bottom line here is this rapidly approaches 0, right? It's not happening. It's not going to be a good situation because we're all going to be solving slightly different variations of the problem. And I think this is where we want to separate out helping and handoffs and coordination from this idea of actually collaborating. Because we've got to do something different to say, yes, on knowledge work, we are collaborative. And what is that thing? Well, this is where I think that I want to argue that true collaboration is creating of a common mind from several minds. That is, that we have left our own mind behind a little bit and moved on to something else. So how would that might work? Well, I think that if we're going to expose our minds, we have to do something And that is some sort of conversation, what I like to refer to here as curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue. There's a couple keywords. Curiosity fueled. And I don't know how many of you are Ted Lasso, but that famous scene with the darts, he says, if you were curious, you would have asked me some things. You would have tried to engage me, understand my position, not just tell me yours. So curiosity is, I think, a key part here. Respectful, that I'm not going to tell you you're wrong necessarily. I may think you're full of crap, but I'm going to listen respectfully to try to say, where are you coming from? And then it's going to be back and forth because you're going to do the same to me. We have to, this is how we as human beings expose our minds to each other. We don't have the chips fully in place yet to read the minds. We actually have to have these conversations. Curiosity fueled, respectful dialogue. And what we start to see emerging when we do that is that a new mind forms. It's not really what I was thinking. It's not really what you were thinking, but it's a combination of what's coming up. And when you're doing this well in this common mind, what you start to experience is like, we came up with something that neither one of us had fully in place when we started. And we like it typically better than what we had because it fills the gaps, it fills the voids, because we had that curiosity-filled, respectful dialogue that allowed us to shape and form this new common mind. And notice that the common mind says we have a common understanding of the problem in discovery. We have a common idea of how we're going to solve it. And then we're going to have a common idea of how to implement it. That's what we're looking for, because when we have that in common, we're going to vastly reduce the amount of rework and miscommunication that drives up a lot of the effort on our projects that is delivering absolutely no value. Okay. And I do want to say that helpfulness, handoffs, and coordination are still important here. We're still going to be doing those, but they are insufficient in and of themselves, and they have to be helpful handoffs and coordination about the common mind, not about the individual minds trying to work together, but helpful handoffs and coordination around the common mind. That's where we're going to see the real benefit of those practices, because we first collaborated, built the common mind, and then we can execute these other good practices on top of that, rather than just driving it down. So this is what I'm going to argue is true collaboration. It's the forming of the common mind and then working around that common mind as opposed to just jumping off and doing something else. But there's a problem here. We've got an issue here that we need to deal with because we're trying to build a common mind. And does that scale very well? Right? We have sometimes problems making up our own mind, let alone build a common mind. And so let's just illustrate this problem a little bit, right? So I've got a mind here, and it understands the problem, the invention, and the implementation, and understands those three things, right? And so I've got it. I got one person, and notice I don't have to collaborate much, right? Just as long as I don't have some sort of issue going on, this is my understanding of this. Fair enough. Right? But what happens if I add a person? Well, now I have two people, and now I have to spend some time doing the work of forming mind, that curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue. We've got to do work to form that common mind, to make sure that we're going to avoid tons of rework. Now, we are going to have to spend some effort to avoid rework. The bottom line typically is that the effort we spend here is vastly smaller than the effort we would spend reworking it later on. We see this shrinking it by a factor of 10 or so, but we have to do the work. And with two people, yeah, maybe I can pull that off. It's not too bad. What if I add a third person? Well, I've gone from one collaboration point to 3 collaboration points. Now I have to work these 3 minds, so I still have that common mind here, sitting here in the middle. I want to still have a clear understanding that we all agree on what the problem is, what the overall solution looks like, and then how to execute against that solution. But I now have to spend more time coming up with that common brain. If I add another person, wow, my number of collaboration points now is vastly exceeding the number of people. It's starting to go up faster than the number of people. And that means I have to spend more time and more effort making sure they're all on the same page. And if we just go up to 5, a reasonable sized team, I suggest, is 5 people. We see a lot of our agile teams being 5 people. Notice how the collaboration points now has dramatically increased. We're up to 10. In fact, it's going to start ricocheting up super, super fast. And this is not sustainable. It's hard to have a common mind when you have so many minds you need to coordinate it. And so some people say, well, what happens if we do this? Why don't we just add another team? And it's like, okay, but now we have to have these 2 teams to have a common mind of some kind if we want to avoid the massive amounts of risk and rework due to miscommunication, because we have different ideas of what the problem is, different ideas how to solve it, and different ideas how to implement it. And so this doesn't seem to work all that great either if we're just relying on handoffs, helpfulness, and coordination. We've all been there. It doesn't meet the test. We need to find a way to collaborate here. So how do we solve this kind of problem of scaling? How do we do this? Well, we have 2 basic techniques that we're going to do this. We're going to partition and we're going to abstract. And where we partition and abstract, we will form a common mind at that level. For example, down here, let's say I have 2 teams that want to work a handoff to each other. That one team has one common mind, another team has another common mind. How are we going to make sure that this works? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to build an interface between them. They're going to talk and form a common mind about this interface thing. That's what's really important here. We're going to collaborate around the interface. We're going to pull ourselves away from our individual problems and collaborate and form a common mind around the interface. This is a partitioning kind of scheme and allows us to say, I don't need a common mind in my place as long as I've done the work to form a common mind around that interface. But what if I have more teams and we don't really have interfaces? Well, then I'm going to abstract. I'm going to pull up to different layers of conversation. You can see I have these layers over here about use cases, these layers about value paths or stories, or if you look in the solution side, system architecture, feature spec, code and test. And so we go up, we'll say, okay, if I'm looking at, say, story at the level, these stories are strung together to deliver something of value. And someone else is going to hold that level of abstraction of the overall value proposition different than the individual stories that comprise it. And so we'll have a different level of abstraction. One of the great tools here that we see organizations like a Scaled Agile framework do is that they're going to have this triad. And this triad is going to say, we're going to have someone who really cares about the problem, someone who really cares about the solution, and a person to make sure that they're actually collaborating, someone who cares about the process. And we're going to say, okay, now we have both these parts. We can then say we have them work together to form a common mind and present that common mind and constrain and set rules underneath. Because that's what abstraction does. It's basically saying, at this level here, for example, I'm going to set constraints for this level below so they know what's going on and they can act appropriately. And this level will set constraints for the levels below it. They don't make the detailed decisions at the bottom. They create constraints that the levels below live within. So our strategies for scaling up the idea of collaboration is to go from one individual to add individuals, but we add individuals, we can have that curiosity-filled, respectful dialogue. But after we get about 5 to 7, we've seen the sweet spot all over the place in knowledge work teams. Around 5 to 7, we've got to create either some partitions, so we have individual work, but then really collaborate on the interfaces, or we create abstraction layers that take it up and build some object that's slightly different that constrains the object underneath it. Like I have a use case. Well, the use case has all these different paths, contains these paths. The use case constrains what the paths can be. The paths constrains what the stories or the steps could be, right? We can then use that as a decompositional strategy to abstract out to different levels so that we can say at the level above, do we have a collaborative common mind? So this is our strategy overall. But I suggested to you at the beginning that this isn't necessarily easy to do, right? This curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue I mean, if this was easy, we'd all be doing it. And it turns out it's not easy. It turns out that enough analysis has been done on this is that you have to force collaboration. You cannot just ask for it. I saw a study from Cisco years ago in the early 2010s that they analyzed this and they said, yeah, teams that say they want to be collaborative tend to fall back into helpfulness, handoffs, and coordination without truly forming the common mind. To get the common mind to be formed, they have to step it up a bit. They have to add additional practices to force that. They cannot allow the team just to say we're going to be collaborative because that doesn't work. The intention's there, but people don't do it. So what practices do we use to form a common mind? Now, I'm going to lean heavily initially here on Scrum because Scrum is actually filled with practices that are designed to form a common mind. But most people don't use them that way. Most people use them as coordination, helpfulness, and handoffs. But if you use them correctly, in my opinion at least, if you use them correctly, you're actually going to be forcing a common mind. So what are these practices that we see there and other practices? Well, story pointing. This is an interesting one because a lot of people think story pointing, oh, a point equals one staff day, and they're actually going off and trying to estimate how much effort something is. And that's not the intent here at all with story pointing. Story pointing could care less about what number you assign something. What it cares about is that we all agree, that we have fleshed out the ambiguity, that we formed a common mind. In this example, you can see one person saying 5, another person saying 13. What that tells us is that these two people see the work differently. They understand the problem differently. They understand the overall solution differently, the discovery invention. They have different ideas. And we got to have that curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue to come to a common mind where we can all agree on how big this is. Is that number absolutely correct? Who cares? That's not the point. The point is to get the common mind that we as a team have decided how much work this is and a general strategy about how we're going to solve it. We understand the problem and we've got a general strategy to how to solve what we've done, high-level invention. That's what this is really all about here. And if we get the number right, added bonus, but it doesn't have any meaning really besides this is what we as a team have agreed to do it because this is how we understand the work. So story pointing is a great technique to help force the common mind. And that's why Scrum says we tend to use this when we're doing analysis and refinement of PBIs because we need to understand how we're going to solve it before we even take it into a sprint. But that's not the only point that Scrum tries to force the common mind. It also tries to form it during sprint planning, where we're going to take that story, which we have sort of agreed to what the problem is. We've sort of agreed what the overall strategy is in assigning points, but now we're going to go to the implementation detail. We need to form a common mind about that. And what we tend to see on well-run Scrum teams is that there is a specialist, like might be my first person here, who's going to stand up and say, okay, here's how we're actually going to implement this. Here's the methods we're going to change. Here's the classes we're going to create. Here's the data structures we're going to have to change to make this happen. And they design it in front of the rest of the team. And the rest of the team is doing that curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue to understand it, to question them, to really grok what's going on here. Because while the expert understands what to do, the rest of the team are developers. They're professionals as well. They can ask good questions. I've seen firmware people and software people do this. The firmware person saying, here's how we're going to do it. Now they're going to implement this in C. It's really detailed about the firmware, but other developers in the software can understand basic logic and they can say, oh, I see what you're doing here. That makes sense. And maybe later on, if the world is turning right, they maybe will help out that firmware person. The software can help out that firmware person trying to get something done because they may be what's lagging to get that most important thing value. But from a collaboration standpoint, sprint planning is an intense collaboration session. I was just looking at a overview of someone's agile sessions right now, and they're running 2-week sprints, and they're saying sprint planning is taking 30 minutes or less. And I can guarantee you that no collaboration's happening there. They're just assigning tasks and getting some agreement going, yeah, I think I can do that. No one's actually doing the work to force the collaboration. And that's what sprint planning was really designed to do, is to say, okay, team, we had a general idea. Now we have to get super detailed with each other because we have to force the common mind how we as a team, not you as an individual, but how we as a team are going to implement and take on this problem. And that's not yet even all. I'll even add one more for Scrum, which is the daily stand-up or the daily Scrum. In the daily Scrum, they're looking at that plan that they just created in sprint planning. They're looking at that collaborative mind that they had. And each day they're examining that collaborative mind and saying, is it still holding water given the reality we're facing? Yes, here's what we've changed from it. Here's what we've completed. Here's what we think we're going to take on. But does it still make sense? And I think the answer often is no. The world has changed. We need to add some tasks. We need to take some tasks off. In refinement, we've added some activities that we need to take covering. Who's going to take care of that? We examine and form and reshape our common mind every day during the sprint. It's a forcing collaboration tool. It's not a status reporting tool. We don't care to a certain degree what your status is. What we care about is, do we still have a common mind about how we're solving the problems that we're dealing with right now? On our current story, how are we doing that? And so once you start seeing this, you're going to see that because there's so much curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue going in sprint planning, that our daily scrums could be pretty efficient by saying, okay, we've got that figured out. What's the change? And move on. But those aren't the only techniques that can kind of do this. We have been for years on modeling teams. If you've ever been on a team that's modeled a thing in some sort of model, this particular model is sort of an information model using class notation. But if you've ever been on these teams, the members of the team are forming a collective mind. Now, you can't just build a model like this and then hand it to someone else because that's not going to work. You're back to handoffs again. But what you can do is the members of the team who are analyzing and questioning and looking at this are going to form a common mind. I've done this with many groups around context diagrams. You can't believe the number of teams I go in, and one of my first questions is, what is your product? Tell me about the product, what the boundaries of the product is. And very few people can articulate clearly what the product is, because usually it's a product nested within other products. There's system levels and what they're working on and what some component is. And they're all confused because they're jumping around all these different layers of abstraction. So we have to model together. I use a modeling tool called context diagramming. And in this process, we form a common mind about what the thing is. Now, others may disagree with it outside of us, but we as a team have formed a common mind. And models can do this. There's something that we are working on that we have to ask each other questions in that curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue to actually understand what's going on. So that's just one technique that we might not associate typically with that, but you could use this on Agile projects. In fact, I highly encourage it. Another one you may have run into is pair programming or multi-person programming. This is where we have one person at the keyboard and one or more people sitting around interacting with the keyboard. And again, with that curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue. Tell me about, they're talking about what function writing, and they're asking questions, trying to understand it, help maybe challenging a little bit to make sure it's really sharp. But again, we're forming a collective mind here. Yes, we have this one person who's doing most of the driving, but they are interacting with others and they're creating something that's probably not in their mind to start with, that because it's being expanded and exposed as it tries to communicate it and form that common mind with other people. So that's what I think is really critical here. As you look at these different practices, all of them are coming down with the same basic strategy. As a team, as a set of people, can we build something together, right? The idea here is, can we build something that all of us work on together that we have to form? Because I think this is the linchpin of forming that collaborative mind. Not you build it and give it to me, not you build it and tell me about it, but we build it together. And so if you look at the Scrum events we talked about, thus backlog refinement, getting stories in a ready state, the team is supposed to do that together. As we do sprint planning and create the sprint plan, the team is supposed to do that together. The daily stand-up or the daily scrum, we're supposed to do that together. Pair programming, we're doing that together. Modeling, With the team, we're doing that together. We're building something together. And this is the key. And so you should be looking at your practices right now and saying, where is it that we're building something in? No, I build it and then I hand it to you and you build it and that's something. No. We as an entire team are actually interacting together to build something together. That's the key thing here to drive it forward. All right. So summary thoughts here. Quick review of what we've been arguing, or at least I've been arguing about what true collaboration really is. So true collaboration to me is this curiosity-filled, respectful dialogue that forms a common mind. This is critical. We are actually interacting with each other and we're trying to get away from our own ideas, what's happening, to form this common mind. And when I say the common mind, we're talking about we understand the problem the same way. We did it for that discovery piece. We understand our basic solution strategy. That's the invention piece. And we even understand the implementation details of how we're going to execute that as a team. And Scrum has built in a lot of these practices right off the bat. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to do that by building something together. And we're going to have to do that something together at the appropriate interface or abstraction level. And that's going to be different for different teams, what that appropriate level is going to be. Because for some teams, if we're, let's say, running Scrum, we're going to try to shrink all the batches, all the stories down to something that fits. And so we've got it that level. So someone else, and this is where the product owner has to step in and say, okay, I know that these 7 little stories add up to the true value that I want to deliver. I have to keep the constraints true at that level of abstraction, the top level that constrains or gives rules to that bottom level so they can build it correctly. We have to set that up. And when you see things like Safe or Nexus, you're seeing that they're trying to say, okay, what do we build together? And who is at different levels of abstraction and what are they building? If you're trying to make Safe work for you, for example, what you need to understand is that the different levels, what are they building together that constrains the level underneath it? And finally, the last ones are building something that technically constrains the compiler. And says, the compiler, this is what I need you to do. So that's Earl's argument about what true collaboration is. Came in at just under 40 minutes, so looking pretty good. I saw the chat come in for a couple of times.
Thank you, Earl. That's very informative, very interesting conversation. I did get a couple of questions come in while you were talking.
Okay.
Let's take a look here. Isn't having clear communication good enough? Why do the extra work of being collaborative?
I think the bottom line here is rework costs.
Mm-hmm.
I think if when you have these separate minds, you haven't done the work of forming the common mind, you're just telling someone about your mind. We often will use words and mean slightly different things. This is the beauty of natural language. Natural language is ripe for ambiguity. One of the things we do in my requirements class is we just take the nursery rhyme, Mary had a little lamb. And the Mary had a little lamb idea is different word emphasis even can mean different things. Mary had a little lamb versus Mary had a little lamb. Well, had means it's past tense, but now little is about size. And then if I put that sentence in a different context, John had a large steak for dinner. Mary had a little lamb. What does it mean now? Right? And so natural language is so full of that ambiguity. Unless you do the work to form that common mind, you're going to probably driving tons and tons of rework.
Good enough. Another question came in from Atika regarding the common mind. Is there any part of common mind that has critical thinking?
I would hope so. Right. If we're talking about critical thinking, I think hopefully what we're talking about here, again, natural language being the ambiguity that it is. When we're talking about critical thinking, we're looking at things and trying to analyze it from multiple dimensions to make sure it doesn't step on its tone, as opposed to just falling into groupthink. This is why you'll see things like in story pointing, for example, why we all show our numbers at the same time. Why do we do that? To avoid the groupthink problem. If I say it's a 5 and you were thinking it's really a 2, but you heard me say a 5 and you think I'm the expert, you might be going, oh, maybe I should give this a 5 because I haven't reported my number yet. But if we lay it all down at the same time, I see your 5, you see my 2. Now we can start that curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue that's critical to critical thinking, that exposes those different parameters. And so, yes, I think the act of trying to form a common mind, especially in the practices we see like in Scrum, addresses some of that critical thinking. You can also see it in that pair programming. If you got decent pairs, one of the pairs that used to work really well was a senior programmer and a junior programmer. Why? Because the senior programmer might drive for a while, but the junior person was asking questions, which kept the senior person pretty honest. Like, why are you doing that? Tell me how this, how come of this? Because seeing code is one thing, but the senior person knew all the stuff about why the system was built the way it was up to that point, that the junior person had no clue. And so why are you doing that way would cause them to go reflect, understand the system, and perhaps even change their design because they were forced to reflect in a more critical way. So you can see most of these practices that have that curiosity-fueled, respectful dialogue will incorporate some of that critical thinking.
Yeah, once again, it's like parenting. The
Oh my
parent-child
gosh,
relationship,
yeah.
right? It's right back in here. One more here. How much extra overhead is being collaborative, and really is it worth it if there's a lot of overhead?
Yeah. So one of the things here we got to be careful of is that sizing problem. If you're trying to say we have a team of 20 and we're trying to be collaborative as a team of 20, I think your overhead's going to eat you alive. I'm just sorry. I think that's just too much. You're going to have to find some way to partition or create levels of abstraction. If you're doing a good job partitioning level of abstraction, I don't think you're going to get to that cost trade-off purposes because you're not gone over the limit of how many brains you can actually collaborate. We can see that's pretty useful at that point. One of the issues I see when we do see the costs seem to get high is that we haven't formed the higher levels of abstraction and done the collaboration there. We just expected the bottom team to be collaborative, and they're missing all the constraints. I was working with a team in Berlin of years ago, and they had basically taken their bottom level team and took off all the constraints. We're not going to tell you what the product is. We're not going to tell you what a solution is. We're not going to explain the problem. We're just going to give you an overall business objective and tell you you've got 6 months to figure out a way to solve it. Well, this team would spend 5 months trying to figure out those higher levels of abstraction, those constraints, so they can actually build something because they were experts at building things, not at those different kind of decision levels. And they floundered, and it was a horrible mess. Though everyone loved the fact that they were so empowered to try to drive the business. It's like, that's not what empowerment means here. Empowerment means we as a team within our expertise are able to design our work the best that we see fit. Yeah.
That makes sense. Is it better to collaborate within a skill area or across skill areas? That's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that is an interesting problem. Depends a little bit on the problem you're facing. Most of our software, if we're trying to deliver value on a regular basis, if you're following this agile principles, you'll want a cross-functional skill set that you'll want to say, okay, we want to have all the skills, understanding the problem. We're going to work together. You want cross-functional. If you're working on a huge project, I mean, just massive F-14 fighter software or something like that, you might have a more skill-based discipline because you have to understand, okay, we're going to have, because you're going to have 2 levels of common mind here and that kind of thing. You're going to have some abstraction level, but you're going to have some interface level common mind. But within the 8 people or the 5 people who are writing the firmware for the same module for this fighter program, you're going to want to form that common mind within that subset. I'm working with a company right now that does audio processing, and yeah, they're going to have they're probably going to have one team that's just working on the chip level firmware that might say we're going to collaborate here and have a clear interface to something else because this firmware is 90% of the value of our product. As we process that sound and articulate and manipulate that sound, the UI portion, that kind of stuff is good add-on, but really the value out here. So we really will need to get a common mind how we want to shape the product. So you're not building the product one way, I'm building the same product another way, and then we're going to spend times and months trying to work out the details about this thing isn't integrating very well.
Right. Makes sense. I've got one more question, and this is probably related to the overhead kind of thing. How collaborative do you need to be? Can't we have a work breakdown that gives different work to different groups?
We've been shipping software like that for a long time, right?
It's
The
true.
question, I think the question of how collaborative do we need to be might be better answer is how much do you want to pay for your work? Because I think when we're not collaborative, we have separate minds all trying to solve the same true problem, but different minds that haven't aligned themselves through that curiosity, feel, respectful dialogue. If we have that, then we have tons of rework. Sometimes we get lucky, but we have tons of rework. So you'll still ship, but you'll ship later than you wanted to. Your predictability goes down because we see on projects all the time that the thing that's often been joked as a 90-90 problem. The first 90% of the project takes 90% of the schedule. The last 10% takes another 90% of the schedule because that's when you have all that rework appearing. You didn't plan it. It wasn't part of it. I mean, Mark, you know, a lot of our business comes from companies going, I wish we would just have some level of predictability. I wish we would finish
Absolutely.
anywhere close to on time. And we're not. And I think one of the drivers of that is they're not being collaborative. They have decided to say, oh, we want to get going fast. We're not going to spend the time or effort to collaborate. And then it blows up on them.
It's true. That's a good portion of our business. And I think this is a good time to stop. Earl, I'll ask you
We do
if you
get
have.
one in the chat. You want to get the one in the chat?
Oh yeah, there's one that
Just
just
showed
came
up.
in. Just came in. I I
Yeah.
I don't
So,
want to cut anybody off. Can you
yeah.
expand on the interface and abstraction concepts? How do they identify the interface, and do they always fit the system structures?
Right. So, and I brought up my doodle board here because I'm gonna see if I can doodle this really quick with you here. So the
Cool.
idea is if I'm writing a chunk of code here, chunk of code, and I have to pass a message to your chunk of code, right? Here's where we'd say like there's an API, but we're at the same level of abstraction. Okay? We're at the exact same level of abstraction. That's where we're gonna see the interface. I can think about my problem here. I can do my little right? And you can think your problem here, but on this interface, we have to come to a common understanding of the interface. Right? That's where we're going to form the common mind. But we're at the same level of detail. The code of the interface is the exact same kind of code as in the two modules. You're going to pass me a message, I'm going to pass you back, but we're going to make a contract. This is often you would see this as designed by contract. Once we start going to abstraction, we're creating different kinds of objects. So for example, the fact that I have interface here, I have created above that. Let me drag all this down here so I have a little more space. I may have created above that, a line here, a system architecture that says, oh, these modules will have an interface, but I'm talking them at a more abstract level. I'm not talking about all the codes, the thing. I just identified this with a name, right? I have no idea how it works, what's in there. It's just a name, and this has a name too. And I've drawn a line between them in a model. Well, the line is not the code down here, the line is not this code down here, which is the interface. The line is just a line. It's a different object type, but I've simplified it. I've abstracted from it. I've made it understandable. And this is where we say, okay, by just calling this out to this forces and constrains them to build one of these things. So abstraction layers are just saying, hey, I've got enough complexity here that I need a simplified idea where I can set some rules and some constraints up so to guide these people down here so they can do their best job and not have to try to reinvent that constantly down below. So hopefully that can drive that particular thing. Okay.
Makes sense.
So, all right.
Thanks for your flexible drawing capabilities.
Yeah. Right.
All right, I think we can call this a close here. I want to thank everyone for attending. There was a question about the link to the recording. Yes, you'll receive that as part of a registrant when it's up and live. So anyway, thank you, Earl, very much for your time and for your insight in this topic. Thank everyone for participating, and we'll see you again next time.